and welcome back to yet another video. This week I wanted to talk to you first before I dive on into my costume. I am making one of my favourite costumes by one of my favourite costume designers in the film industry. Her name is Colleen Atwood. She has made so many of my favourite costumes in film and television, and I mean so many of them. I've even recreated and worn some myself at this point, but I have not yet made my most favourite, most magical of all of her costumes, so that is what I'm going to be doing this week for my upcoming trip to Universal Studios Hollywood. So without any further ado, let me show you how I'm going to make Queenie Goldstein's dress designed by Colleen Atwood. Let's go. Here is what we'll be using for this project. For the dress I'll be using Vogue V9328 as the base pattern. Working off of this one here, Busey. So the first thing I did was to consult my pattern drafting books, and the reason for that is because I wanted to swap out the sleeves into lantern sleeves, so I had to figure out how to do that. But more on that in a bit. So let me walk you through some of the changes I made whilst making this mock-up. The first, most obvious one is I did away with the original skirt entirely. Next, I lowered the neckline in the front and completely redid the back. So originally on the pattern, the back was made up of 4 panels across. Mine is now made up of 2, and it's also got the same V that we have in the front. The Queenie's skirt is an asymmetrical, longer on one side, higher on the other skirt, and so I had to completely draft that myself. It's also got a wide band at the waist that goes diagonally across that has some cool little pin tucks in it, so that's what we've done there. And then on either side, in the front and the back, it's got a semicircle which gives the nice waterfall effect in the corners of the skirt. And the last thing I did is I actually kept the top half of the sleeves but did away with the bottom, and now instead of bishop sleeves I have lantern sleeves with a cuff that has a little wingtip on it. So now that my mock-up is all done and all ready to go, the fun bit begins. I get to unpick everything. Let's go. The reason I have to unpick everything is because I'm actually going to be using all of these pieces as the new pattern pieces. And the reason I'm doing that is because I made so many changes to this mock-up that they're no longer the same as the original paper pattern pieces that I drew out, so it's so much easier just to use these pieces, and that way I don't have to draw out any new paper patterns. Don't look, she's naked. Anyway, time to talk to you about the fabric I'm using. So I have this double gorget in this really nice navy colour. Unfortunately, it's not as see-through as the original dress that I made, but it is kinda, yeah. Anyway, it's a really nice fabric, so let's cut it out. So I just wanted to jump on here and take a second to talk about seam finishing for this costume. So on the original version used in the film, if you zoom in really closely on the screen worn costumes, you can see that the edges are actually finished with pinking shears. And when I made this costume the first time as well, I also finished the edges with pinking shears. And the reason they did that is because that's one of the finishes that was easily available in the 1920s when this film's set, and so historical accuracy. However, as I now want this costume to be a part of my everyday wardrobe, pinking is great, but it doesn't last as long as, say, overlocking does. So here you can see the 2 different finishes side by side, and I will be going for overlocking on this one, which isn't screen accurate, but it will make the garment last longer. Also, now that all of the pieces are cut out, I have now got to try and remember the jigsaw piece puzzle that is this dress and how to put them all together, so here's hoping I can do that. I think I start with darts. Correct, I do in fact start with the darts, first the ones in the bust. Darts are sewn into the 2 front panels. Now before I start sewing everything together, what I'm going to have to do is overlock all the edges first, because they're much easier to do when they're flat pieces like this, rather than after having sewn them together, so I'll be right back. After all the overlocking was done, it was time to attach the 2 centre front pieces together in the centre front. And then I sew on the 2 side front pieces. And ta-da! That is the front panel done. Now it's time to repeat that same process with the back pieces. First I sew together the centre back seam, and then I test how it's looking, and then I sew together one of the side seams, leaving the other one open because I'm going to put an invisible zip in there later. Next is the shoulder seams. And that's most of the top part done. So next I'm working on the lower portion or the skirt. First, using some chalk, I draw some guidelines on the waistband bit where all of the future pin tucks will go. And this process took forever because I had to be so careful to try and make sure that all the stitching was even all the way down. I did my best and this is how it turned out. So next I sew the waistband bits to the skirt portion. Once again, just checking the fit of everything as I go to make sure it is heading in the direction that I want. Happy with it all, I sew the skirt and waistband to the bodice.
Okay, so I just did a silly on this, and I'm wondering if it's going to be one of those things that only I'm going to notice and nobody else will. Let me show you what I mean. So in doing the pleated detail here, I accidentally forgot to draw in a seam allowance, which means I forgot to draw in the 1.5 centimeter extra bit of fabric on the top and bottom edge of the stripes. To combat that, when sewing it in, I sewed it with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, and I don't know if it's worth the hassle to unpick it and redo all the pin tucks and that, because that is honestly the hardest part of this project, and I really do think that I'm going to be the only one who notices it. So for now, that is how it is. I'll tell you later whether or not I do go and redo it. At this moment, I don't think I will. So yeah, because I'm making silly mistakes like that, I think it is a good time to call it quits for today. See you guys tomorrow.
The next day.
I redid it. So I was doing the back panel this morning and I had this epiphany. I had drawn the seam allowance on the front piece. It just turns out that the seam allowance also counts as one of the pin tuck stripes. So I cut out a new piece and I sewed it in, and this time where the seam allowance is now a pin tuck as well. It makes more sense. I'll show you right now.
So here, if you look at both the top and bottom seams, you can see they've actually been incorporated into pin tucks.
All I have to do now is add the sleeves and figure out this part here. I couldn't resist trying it on, and as you can tell, you know, it's fitting a bit funky, but I am wearing, you know, clothes underneath it, so that's probably why. But yeah, really happy with how it's coming along so far. Let's get on to the sleeves.
Once again, using the mock-up pieces that I drafted earlier, I cut out the new pieces out of the gorget. And after overlocking all the pieces, I then sew the top half of the sleeve to the bottom half of the sleeve. Next, I cut out some strips of bias so that I can make bias tape coverings for the little keyhole bit that she has at the cuff. I have no idea what it's called, but yeah, keyhole bit, let's go with that. First, I sew the bias strip to the outside of the sleeve on the right side of the fabric along that little keyhole opening just here. Then I cut the keyhole open. Then I fold over one side of the bias and flip it onto the inside and sew it all in place so that the raw edge is all encompassed, creating the keyhole opening. Next, I fold the sleeve over itself and sew up the seam here. Then I gather the top part of the sleeve around where the shoulder is and attach it to the bodice. At this point, I was dying to see what the elbow seam there would look like beaded, so using some bugle beads, I hand sewed them along that seam there. After I finished the beading, I decided it was a great time to tackle the two straps that she has running along the neckline of the dress. I started by cutting long lengths of bias and sewing those into spaghetti straps. Then I cut out an 1.5 inch wide strip of skin coloured tulle, which I would use as the base to attach the spaghetti straps to. Next, I add the tulle strips to the neckline of the bodice. After I'd sewn the tulle into the neckline, I then realised I forgot to add the straps in, which I should have done first so that they could get covered by the seam of the tulle. But I didn't end up being happy with these, and you'll see a bit more about that later. And because I wasn't happy with the straps, I then decided to hem the dress instead, so I did a small rolled hem along the bottom edge of the skirt, which I then hid the stitching line with using this pre-beaded ribbon tape. So I pinned this to the hem after you can see I've stitched a lot of bugle beads along the actual hem of the dress, and then I hand sewed that entire ribbon strip along the hem of the dress. After the hem was done, I didn't want to look at that neckline again, so I thought I would move on to making the slip instead. For the pattern, I'm using Vogue V1962 View A as the base. And for the fabric, I'm using this dusty peach colour. It is a sandwash satin. First, I cut out all of the pattern pieces, of which there were 3. Then I sew the darts at the bust. With the darts on, I then overlap all of the edges of the pieces. Then I sew the 2 back pieces together down the centre. The back piece then gets sewn to the front piece down the side seams.
Alright, now that the front and back are sewn together, I've just pinned it on the mannequin, and as you can see, we have a raw edge running along here. Now the pattern calls for putting lace over the top of this and then hiding the seam that way. However, I don't want to put any lace on this, so what I'm going to do is to create a facing, basically cutting out the pattern piece again, but this time cutting it so that it only comes to here, so it'll sit like that. And that way I can just fold it underneath and it'll give us a nice finished edge like that, without having to put any lace on top of it.
To make the facing, I basically make a very, very short version of the actual slip itself. And before the facing gets sewn into the dress, I first have to make some spaghetti straps. As you can see, they're very simple. I just fold those long strips in half and then sew them lengthwise. I then trim away the excess fabric, and then using a loop turner, I turn them the right way out. Next, I attach them to the slip itself, so I have the slip pinned on the mannequin to the height that I want it to rest at, and I'm just draping the straps over. And once I was happy with how they sat, I then sewed them in place to the slip. I then repeated this step for the back of the slip as well. Once I was happy with how the straps were sitting, I could then sew the facing into the neckline of the slip. After the facing was completely sewn in, I turned it right way out, and then I did a little top stitching detail along the edge of it, just like hers has.
Hello and good morning. Right, it has been a couple of months since I worked on this. I had to stop because I just wasn't happy with how the neckline was looking. It was terrible and I thought I could do better, so I let it sit for a couple of months and now I'm ready to tackle it. So what have I done? I have taken off everything I previously did in this area because I think it just looked janked as. It was not sitting nice and tight, it was warping, it just really didn't look good. So I am going to redo it, obviously. So far I have just done the spaghetti straps again, and now I'm going to put in the tulle and attempt a new way of tacking the straps to the tulle so that it doesn't sit so warpy. Also, cuffs. And then that's it. She is finally done and I can just wear it and then never have to think about it again. So let's cut some tulle.
I cut out some strips of tulle just like last time, except I'm using a different tulle this time that's actually nice and soft and flexible, whereas the last one was hard and harsh and scratchy and I hated it. So here I am trying on the dress first, and the straps have already been sewn in place into the back, and now I'm positioning them so that they fit nice and snug around my curves and then pinning them in the front. Once I was happy with how both the straps were laying, I then sewed the tulle into place around the neckline. Then I flipped the tulle sleeve over and top stitched along the edge of the blue to give it a nice finish.
Okay, so what I've done here is I have pinned the spaghetti straps to the tulle, you can see just there, and what I think will make this better and less warped than what I had last time is instead of stitching the entire way down the strap, is if I just tack it. So like tack it there, there, just do a series of little tacks all the way, and that should stop it from warping too much and also help it keep its shape. So fingers crossed that works. That's what I'm gonna do now. And here it is after being tacked down. It's a lot less wonky than the original one, but it's a little bit still wonky, but at this point I'm just seriously over it and this is good enough for me, so I'm going to move on and do the other side now. Alright, cool news about Queenie. I have one side of the costume entirely done, which includes the straps and then the sleeve. So I have a cuff on it now, it's got the beading detail along the tip and a tiny self-covered button here. And as you can see, this side here is currently lacking all of that, so let me show you how it's all done.
First I used my pattern drafting book to help me draft a pointed cuff. And then I learnt this really cool trick for making the fabric easier to cut, and that is to stiffen it first using something like hairspray, which is what I'm doing here. And boy oh boy do I wish I had learnt that trick at the beginning of this project, because it made working with this fabric so much easier. It stops it from shifting around and warping when you're working with it. Anyway, moving on to assembling the cuffs. So I'm marking off the seam allowance along the bottom edge of one of them and then pinning them together and sewing them together. I leave the bottom edge of the cuff open so that I can turn them right side out and eventually sew them to the sleeve. But before I do that, I make sure to trim away all the excess fabric in the seam I just sewed so that they're easier to turn right side out and they have a crisper point. And of course, to achieve max crispiness, I have to iron it as well. Then they get pinned and first machine stitched to the edge of the sleeve. Then I fold along that seam that I marked earlier, encompassing the raw edge that I just created, and then I hand stitch the cuff on the inside of the sleeve. Next I need to add a button and loop attachment, so to do that I'm using a self-covering button, and once again using that hairspray trick that I wish I knew for the whole thing, and cutting out a circle of the fabric. Then I do some tiny gathering stitches along the circumference of the circle I just cut out. Then I insert the white part of the self-covering button into the circle that I've just created, and I pull all the gathers tight so that the white part is nice and snug in the centre. Then I put the metal back onto the back of the button, push down so that the shank's exposed, and voila, I now have a button that perfectly matches the fabric of the dress. This then gets sewn to one side of the cuff, and then to create the loop, I do this loop and knot thing. I'm not sure what this is called, I'm so sorry, but I create like a chain stitch of thread, and I create a loop out of that so that the button can loop and close. And with that done, the costume is relatively finished. Let's just get to the reveal already. have it. That is how I made my Queenie Goldstein costume from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. This costume, I wish I could say I liked it. I wish I could say I was happy with how it turned out, but the only thing I'm happy with is the wig and that I bothered to bead it. I don't know what went wrong with this. I hadn't really worked with the fabric Georgette, I don't know how it's pronounced. I hadn't really worked with that before, and it's a lot more slippery and twisty than I expected, and as a result I feel like a lot of the panels that I sewed, especially in the front, got twisted and warped as they were sewing together, which makes the whole thing sit off kilter. I didn't discover until I was about 9/10 of the way through sewing it that things existed like I'm not actually sure what they're called, but a stiffening spray for all intents and purposes. So one example is I could use hairspray, spray the fabric, and then it sits nice and stiff. And that means so that when you're sewing it together, it doesn't warp, it doesn't fray as easily, which I think I needed for constructing the whole costume. Do I think I'll make this again? Absolutely not. It's a shame because I do really like the dress and I was hoping to, have this as part of my everyday wardrobe, but it's just not up to my own personal standards, and therefore it'll be getting passed on to somebody else who wants it. And that's okay. Sometimes you get disappointed with projects, but it just means when I work with that fabric in the future, I now know how to treat it when I'm sewing with it. So this was a big learning curve, and instead of taking me a week to make like I predicted it would, it took me probably a month, and that's not including the breakdown I had halfway through making it because I thought it was looking terrible and I gave up on it for like 2 months. So yeah, I got it done in the end, and that's all that matters. I learned something. Anyway, if you like this video, maybe consider leaving a like down below. Let me know what you thought of the dress in the comments below, and if you really like the video, maybe even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting and fun related things here on this channel, and with all that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye!
Dear